Welcome to the Scale with Stride podcast, the place where you come to listen to some of the world's most influential leaders of the SaaS industry. Hi, Dave. Welcome to the Scale with Stride podcast. How are you doing?
Yeah, good. Thanks, Adam. Thanks for inviting me.
No worries. And how did you get on yesterday? I know you were speaking at an event.
Yeah, great. I think every audience is interested in Gen.AI, but I've got some contrarian views as well. So yeah, interesting stuff.
Fair enough. Well, listen, thanks for joining us, and welcome to the Scale with Stride podcast. I've been really looking forward to this, to be honest, Dave. Obviously, like you and I have known each other quite a while now. We've had a lot of fun together over the last couple of years.
Yeah,
But yeah, I think given the sort of topic of conversation, just interested to learn so much about what you've been doing and your perspective on the Gen AI market. So I suppose for the people listening to the podcast who don't know who you are, could you just give us a little bit of background, your story and ultimately how you've arrived at today where, you're advising within this space?
Yeah, absolutely. So not a lot of people know, but I started life actually as an IFA or as an FA, financial advisor. So I think that really helped in my go-to-market career because I learned how to run portfolios. And I also learned about what makes money. And I think that's really important. We'll come on to that for Gen.AI as well. I then was basically 20 years in software and various different horizontal and vertical. And I think that's really important as well. So really also understanding what really full GTM is. So not just, pure sales, not just pure marketing or CS, but kind of the whole combination. And also very global. And I think that's a big one as well in terms of where Gen.AI is and sort of that scale. I spent, before jumping into Gen.AI, actually was at a SaaS company that we took to a unicorn. All the stuff that's happening with Gen.AI now, I did that, 10 years ago.
Yeah.
And it's super interesting to see, kind of where Gen.AI is going, the scalability of revenue and how quick things are changing in comparison to a lot where the SaaS world is, so we look at typically quarter by quarter growth, whereas people are talking about day by day growth, which is pretty exciting stuff. So I was asked to help jump in and help Stability AI back after I left the SaaS world. And I was really, for me, advising already a bunch of SaaS companies, but I really want to learn more around the Gen AI space, really deep down in the actual model making. And so I became the GTM advisor for Stability AI. And we had some crazy days, so some really testing times as well with the team, but we also produced a fantastic turnaround with the company. And, you can see now in terms of where they're going, what they're doing, that it's truly one of the giants of image and in general around generative AI. And then a couple of weeks ago, I launched Scale Gen.AI, and that's all around go-to-market growth for basically generative AI companies. And there's so much more to do on that front because we're right at the beginning of this ecosystem.
Yeah. And I suppose so from going from CRO of a unicorn SaaS business to now advising, technology companies at the cutting edge of software and artificial intelligence, just talk me through specifically what it is that you and your advisory, your consultancy within Scale Gen.AI is hoping to achieve. What's the value that you bring to your customers?
Yeah, so it's an interesting one right now. There's a lot of folks talking about the 5-person Gen.AI startup or the 1-person $1 billion Gen.AI startup, which I can tell you is definitely not the case right now, right? As much as everyone is hyping it up. But it's really important to think about what we're trying to do in generative AI is do more with less. So we've already been in that model, right? With, growth at all costs. So GAC with SaaS, a lot of SaaS companies kind of went down into that mode of kind of trying to get as much revenue per head, as much growth per head as possible. And in Gen.AI, it actually is possible to do that with a lot of automation. And so what Scale Gen.AI is about doing, and we did this with Stability, and not a lot of the guys have actually got the right way to grow GTM. So they're typically thinking about, okay, I'm building a fantastic product. I've got a great R&D team, and then they get some money in, and they start thinking, okay, we now need to grow GTM. The problem is
Yeah.
a lot of that is very, very early, and the behavior at the moment tends to be hiring more junior folks into that GTM stack, like a founding account exec, for example, and they might have 4 or 5 years experience, and that's great. They're good at understanding Gen AI, but they haven't got the attributes or the understanding of real growth and scale. And
Yeah.
that was something that I was asked a lot by founders of seed A round startups in Gen AI to help, because it's really important to understand, the way those products are developed and the way that they're delivered is fundamentally, it's like SaaS on steroids. It really, really is. Like
Yeah.
every single day something changes. You have to iterate and adapt your product all the time. And
Yeah.
with automation, you can do that. So it's the same going to GTM. It's about a hybrid approach of human and AI, both agent and Gen AI as well. And we'll come back to what the differences of those as well. But that's in a nutshell what Scale Gen AI is. It's about basically delivering growth through both human and agentic or generative AI implementation in those startups,
Yeah.
and doing it as well at scale and at pace. Because the difference between a pre-seed, seed, and an A round is now about 12 months. So I haven't got the
Okay.
stats in front of me, but you are literally looking at 12 to 18 months difference, sometimes 6 months between pre-seed, seed, and A in terms of raise. And so you can think about that scale. You go back in the SaaS days, that might, well, there wasn't really a pre-seed, but like even seed to A round to B round might be 3 years apart in
Yeah.
terms of that growth. And so Scale Gen AI is also providing fractional, and we're working with a bunch of groups around the world as well to put those people in, but have specific Gen AI experience as well, which is quite hard to find at the moment. And we're one of the boutique advisories that's providing that.
Cool. Well, no, it's good to know, and I think it's such an interesting topic that like really does, gets my curiosity. But there's been an explosion of interest and hype around Gen AI. I
Yeah.
think from the launch of ChatGPT at the back end of 2022, there's been like a massive influx of companies that are obviously leverage that technology to then build products of their own. But I suppose like where do you think we are in the cycle?
Yeah, so I think we're actually still early in in terms of maturity. We're
Yeah.
not early in terms of base models. So you've got to think about these things as different layers, right? So when people are talking about agents or agentic AI, that's basically built on top of multiple areas like databases and base models. So like the base model guys, so the guys like OpenAI, it's still very early in terms of innovation as to where they're going to end up, but the actual underlying technology is getting to a little bit more maturity. And so some of the challenges are coming through from that. But I think the other part is we're probably 3 to 5 years away from real market maturity as Gen AI, and I think that also comes back to adoption. So there's been so many proof of concepts, so much talk and buzz, but the actual reality of implementation is still pretty low.
Yeah. Okay. And I think like with regards to the growth of the industry itself, like I was doing some research leading up to the podcast and just through my own knowledge of the industry and obviously with the help of some AI, namely ChatGPT. I just want to like go through a couple of like facts. So there's been a huge explosion of Gen AI companies. So from a search I did, there's around 3,000 that I'd identified specifically within generative AI, and that's just across the US, EMEA, and APAC. Now, the US absolutely dominates this. They've got over 55% of the organizations in the space are from the US, and a big share of that over in San Fran. You've got smaller hubs in the likes of Europe, Paris, Berlin, London, which, you'd expect in those kind of cities. But from an investment perspective, the numbers are just absolutely staggering. So the US has invested nearly $1 trillion into the industry. And when you compare that with EMEA and APAC, that combined's got less than 15 billion, it just shows who's really paving the way and betting on Gen AI. And the other thing that was quite interesting, so the majority of companies are less than 3 years old. So a lot of them being
Yeah.
founded in 2023 off the back of the launch of
Yeah.
ChatGPT. And so OpenAI clearly had a profound impact on the industry and what they've created. So what I suppose, like, what are you seeing? Why do you think all of a sudden, ChatGPT comes out and then boom, they just explode? But also the sort of disparity in terms of the US and the rest of the world in terms of where, who's really backing this horse?
Yeah, sure. So I think, first of all, in terms of why ChatGPT and then why this explosion, I think there's a couple of points. So first of all, the market in general. ChatGPT wasn't first. OpenAI wasn't the first model out there, right? There were other models that were built prior. It's just that the scale of that launch and the hype around it, I'm sure you remember it just as much as I do, that
Yeah,
drove an interest in Gen AI that was previously not really known. And you've got
yeah,
others that, if you go back in time, things like RPA, so like robotic process automation and this kind of
yeah. We did loads with like UiPath.
exactly, so those technologies which people now say, oh, that's old school. In reality, they're the building blocks to generative AI, even ML, right? So I've seen a lot of people not really understand as well what generative AI is. And this is my point as well around, generative AI is providing you with answers, but then ML was providing you with some of that. It's just that the way in which it's built is effectively better and more scalable. And the more that we go towards automation of that, towards more agentic AI, then that
Yeah,
gives you even more potential for that growth. And I think, AI itself, it really is a buzzword. It's an engine, right? It's like saying SaaS, software as a service, same sort of thing. It is an
yeah,
industry, but it's more than that because it's changing the behavior of how we interact. I mean, like you mentioned, the way you're using GPT, but it's like, again, like when search first came through.
yeah,
But as with all that, there are winners and losers. So you kind of talked about investment structure. I mean, I don't know if you remember using Ask Jeeves or some of the old legacy search engines, right?
yeah, yeah,
I was an Ask Jeeves guy. And then, one day it shut down. Obviously, I was also using Google at that point. But my point is at the moment as well, we're still in that Ask Jeeves phase where there's plenty of options and opportunities, all the different models out there, all the different platforms to test. But where this is coming from is also a big driver from Silicon Valley, which, in my opinion, has kind of lost its way with SaaS over the last kind of certainly post COVID. You think about the amount of SaaS businesses that IPO'd post 2022, and it's basically
yeah,
nothing. And I
yeah,
think this is also where there's a lot of people sitting on dry powder in terms of investment structure. The unicorns of 21, 22 in SaaS weren't doing as well as they should. And, we can talk about that as well if you want. But in general, it's also been a huge opportunity for the Valley to kind of reinvent itself. And I've got a lot of founders now that are working with me in Scale Gen.AI who are considering they're living in Berlin, they're living in London, they're living in Paris or somewhere. And they're saying, actually, we need to move to the Valley. We need to move to California in order to do well. And that's a huge kind of hype again. That's sort of this culture underneath, which is unless you're part of YC, unless you're part of that community, your general startup's not going to succeed. And that's another reason why,
yeah,
by the way, for us with like Scale Gen AI, we want to make sure that all models can be proven that, if you've got a really strong idea and you're also solving a really important pain point, and that's another important thing in Gen AI to get right, then actually you've got a real opportunity to create an outcome that gives you great revenue.
yeah. And I think you touched on a good point there. So, like, I want to sort of discuss the role that the investors play into this. So, when I look at the the investors that are like really doubling down in this space. So one of the things that was a surprise and wasn't so surprise. So Y Combinator have got their fingers in over 100 pies within the
Yes.
space.
Yeah.
Techstars 50. So I think first and foremost, like it just shows the impact those kind of incubator kind of schemes and those kind of businesses and the impact that they have within the tech industry, because it's not just unique to Gen AI. Those guys are involved in so many other software businesses, and then a lot of the usual suspects. Your Sequoias, your Lightspeeds, A16Z, NEA, Insight,
Yeah.
Salesforce, Google Ventures. They're in the top 20 investors specifically within this space. The other thing is the average amount of funding that I looked at for these businesses was 100 million. Now I know that's thrown out of kilter by the amount that some of the your Anthropics and your OpenAIs have had, but it's still a staggering amount
It is.
considering most of those businesses are still at like pre-Series A. So like the amount of money that is being put into this, the amount of investors that are jumping on this bandwagon and wanting a piece of it, the valuations that they're throwing around, is this a little bit of FOMO? Is this a bubble? Do you think it's going to burst? Or do you think it's indicative of like the potential of this technology?
So I think it's both actually, and it depends on where you're looking. So firstly, there's definitely FOMO. I think a lot of
Yeah,
the investor track, especially after OpenAI and kind of the initial guys like Stability, were out there and launching, there is a
yeah,
realization that this could be a way for complete human displacement, for example. So like actually the value of an autonomous workforce. So like the sheer opportunity size is just great. But I mean,
yeah,
I saw the other day 129x pre-money valuation of a Gen.AI
yeah,
company, right? Which, we
yeah,
used to talk about valuations that are in the 50 to 60x in SaaS and go,
yeah.
wow, that's insane. But for me,
And
that
that's what it was,
was,
that post-COVID boom. That was
yeah,
50x, when they went on that crazy run, and then,
yeah,
it come
and then
crashing down
dropped
the
off a
last 2
cliff.
years.
Yeah, and then loads of
Yeah,
zombicorns, right? And I think the
yeah,
point
exactly.
is that there is that bubble as well, but there will be some winners in that will have exponential value and growth. But again, going back to that investment model, I think it's also a couple of things that have happened. So one, private equity tends to be getting involved higher up in like Series D and sometimes even Series C, which wasn't a thing before, right? That was normally kind of the VC bubble or area. And also, there was no real pre-seed, right? You have like angel investment, you do a seed, but now there's a pre-seed, and there's more and more folks that are starting their own VC. Kind of, they've got their own from like the guys at OpenAI, etc., are investing as their own personal fund into some of these as well. And so you're
Yeah,
getting these very large pre-seed seed rounds and, to be honest, A rounds, which is almost, an A round is what used to be a B round, is what I'm seeing.
yeah,
And a seed is an A and a pre-seed is a seed. And we've just kind of changed the rhetoric on that. And I think that's the other bit when people are seeing those and they're like, oh my God, look at the size of that. In reality, because of the opportunity size, because of the value on the table, but also because of these market dynamics, I think that's why you're seeing these crazy amounts. But for sure, as with all these economic cycles, there will be a bubble. We had
yeah,
one after 2021. There was, we've been in a bunch of cycles, right? I went through 08, 09, and that was crazy and terrible. And I really hope that doesn't happen again. But like, you always have to be prepared for that as well. If you're funding 10,000 startups, each with, an exponential growth value, and out of that, only 1,000 of them come through, and over that, only 10 of them actually become, a true what was it called, a decacorn, or but like basically the guys that are true growth giants, then it's only the real winners in those 10, and the rest they've lost money on. And I used to see investors
yeah,
doing a 1 in 10 approach, but I'm seeing some of them now saying it's a 1 in 100, where they're almost saying they're
yeah.
spread betting, they're spread investment, and they're hoping that the one that they land on will be that true, one person startup billion.
So, so the thing that I want to talk about now, right? So there's a huge amount of money that's gone into this space, right? And if I look
Yeah,
at back at SaaS, right, the money that goes into it, and then you look at the pressure from boards for sales, for go-to-market, to start generate revenue, so that the investors can start getting a return on their investment. The timeline that they're given to do it, and you've seen, I'm sure like the average tenure of VP sales within the SaaS world is what 18 months or something ridiculous like that. How's this going to change within Gen AI? Because when the market itself is so early, and no one's really seemed to have cracked it yet in terms of converting that model into like a commercial viable product, and then also to build the actual go to market strategy to go with it. There's very few that I've seen that have absolutely cracked that yet. And the reason I say that, I'm looking through this from a recruiter lens. So I've seen a pattern of absolute world class, A player reps, from the likes of your Mongos, your Snowflakes, your Zscalers, all these kind of prolific software businesses that have made the shift from security, from the modern data stack, and thought, let's pile into Gen.AI because of all the money that's going in, the valuations and this artificial growth. And I'm speaking to them 12 months later. Some of these guys have got immaculate sales records, never missed a number. And frankly, they've shit the bed. They've not closed anything. And they're looking to then think, have I jumped in too early? Do I need to get back into the world of SaaS with a product and a proven model? So, this is precisely some of the stuff that you've been doing with some of your clients is turning that model into a business model, to a product that they can sell, and knowing which route to go it down. So, can you just talk to that? I know I've sort of taken you around the houses a little bit, but how are you seeing that transition from building this cutting edge technology and these amazing models to actually turning that into revenue so that the investors can get some of the dollars back? What are you seeing in that respect?
Yeah, so you mentioned the first thing, which I think is always a bit of a concern. And again, this is what we're really looking at from Scale Gen.AI, is making sure that you have sales leadership, go-to-market leadership, either accessible, like something like Scale Gen.AI, or embedded as early as possible in your growth chain, right? And I remember in the SaaS world being told, you're at Series B, at seed, you should have done these things, or at A round, you should have done these things to scale properly, right? And you've now got to go back and fix it all, right? You don't need to do that. There's no need to do that in Gen.AI. There's just therefore too much pressure on that revenue. So that's one issue, because a lot of the times these founding AEs are great guys, but they're quite early still in their sales career. They've not had, they've not got the scars. They've not really understood what it means to grow revenue, especially in a market that's quite frothy. And also the product's not finished. So a lot of the times I'm hearing from founders, we're basically building the plane in the air. So we've launched the plane. We need to make sure it doesn't come down, but we're building this whole thing right now. And especially if you're selling into enterprise, that's a huge, huge area of and that's why, again, why I've seen all these POCs and they're not implementation, because what they're replacing works, right? And so to actually switch that off and move to a fully embedded AI model, it takes a long time and therefore a lot of cost and investment. And if you're that C-suite that said, you're the CMO or the CIO that said, I'm going to make huge changes by bringing in Gen.AI, if that ROI isn't there in the first 3-6 months, you're just going to switch the project off. And then you get this kind of enterprise burnout, which again, I've seen from the other side, because I talk to a lot of C-suite as well, who say, we've tried AI and it doesn't really work, or it's not really for us right now. And that's that maturity model. So obviously, if you've got guys that can take this in and embed it, fantastic. But you've got to be really, really careful that you don't do. And again, I've made the mistake myself in my career where I've over-egged where I believe our business can grow because I can see real opportunity. But the problem is the market's not ready for that level of opportunity. And that's the second piece. Yeah. So I'm getting a lot of clients who are wanting to pivot. And it's not a big deal, by the way, pivoting. A lot of people are like, yeah, look, I'm dead set on my product. They keep plowing their money in. They keep plowing their time into building this thing. And the guys build it, but the velocity of their revenue just isn't there, right? It's it bumbles about. They're still growing, but they're not getting that growth. And so the other part of that then is helping these guys pivot. It might not be pivoting completely to a completely different market or model, but it might be pivoting slightly to a different sub-vertical or a different offer. So one of them, for example, is a voice AI agent that's then pivoted instead to be a call center optimization system, because all of the call centers don't want suddenly to replace 10,000 staff today with an agent. They might want to in terms of an aspiration, but they're not going to give you revenue and then just fire 10,000 people and replace them with 10,000 agents right now. So I think that's the other bit in sort of, I think that kind of where are we going in terms of that market phase. But then
almost dumbing down the product a little bit so that there's less risk, but you can start to see a quicker ROI. And then it's like the Trojan horse. You get it in, and then it works. And then you go to phase 2 where you start to
and I think land expand now is a proof of concept that doesn't get switched off. Land expand in SaaS was a completely different model. But for me, that's what it is. It's a case of build a POC. It doesn't fully work because I've never seen a
Yeah,
POC in Gen.AI work from day one, full stop. That's there. But then make sure, and again, I'm talking about this from an enterprise perspective, that POC is then built with an area of the business that understands, with an integrator that understands that model. And I think that's the other opportunity here, where you can be a little bit more lightweight in terms of your staffing in GTM. Whereas we used to have to
yeah,
hire a lot of folk that did very kind of admin based tasks, tooling based tasks like ops, and we can come on that in a minute, but also implementation and those kind of things. Those can also be done by externals, which also reduces, I think, the need to have super specialized teams in different areas. But yeah, I mean, look, it's all also really new, Adam, and I think that's the other bit. As this evolves, if I was in GTM right now as an AE or as a VP, one of the things I wouldn't be doing is blocking my ears off and saying, I'm not listening to this, or just trying a bit of GPT. I would be spending my time, and I recommend this as well to folks, is take 3 hours out of your weekend and try and get to the bottom of what you want to look at, what you want to achieve. Do you want to try AI SDRs out? Well, funny enough, you can. And it's not just about taking that and embedding it in your own system. It's about really understanding what those things do instead of it being like very black and white, where it's like either I'm fully in AI or I'm kind of, I'm off here and I'm ignoring it.
so, so basically stop trying to go for the Hail Mary when you're selling your product and just go for first down. Basically, just
Yeah.
try and get the little bits at a time, um, and then use that as a way to expand. I mean, so other than what you've just described, then from the companies that you've been working with, I know we talked about some of the successes yesterday, but what are the other common bottlenecks that you're seeing other than knowing like how to take your product to market? What are the other bottlenecks that you're seeing?
So there's a huge one which needs to be called out, which is calling your MRR ARR. And
Yeah,
I've seen founders now, again, this is kind of a valley culture as well, of saying, bro, I hit 10 million in 4 months. And it's actually what they've done is they've extrapolated out 4 months of MRR as an ARR growth plan. And again, remember, this is also sometimes talking about MAU, so as in monthly active users or consumption based models, which also don't necessarily always look like this. Sometimes they do
yeah,
that, right? And I've seen that firsthand, especially in the second half of their first year. So they get like the
yeah,
honeymoon phase, which is kind of months 3 to 6. Sometimes it's very short, but it depends on how good your solution is, but also how much competition is. And then you get this kind of magpie effect where, because your users aren't tied into a full ARR SaaS contract where they basically can't go in it. And don't get me wrong, there are Gen AI companies out there that do have that kind of model, but there's a lot of them that are doing tokenism, credits, ticketing, seats that aren't tying you in for that period. Then those users just switch off your product and go to somebody else, or they downgrade to the free version. And so you're then left with two problems, basically. One is obviously your ARR is less than you told your CFO was going to be. And I've
yeah,
seen that, by the way, firsthand. The other challenge is the acquisition cost to keep that level of growth. It exponentially grows. So you're effectively almost having to buy users with investor capital to maintain that growth that you originally promised. And I think that's a huge piece that's not been tackled or talked about enough, is this bit around, I've got this company, it's doing this in this many months and it's this much value. And there's a couple of them that have done that, but the rest of them, it's just too much hype, mate.
yeah. Well, it's quite interesting because if you look at other businesses that have then adopted the consumption model, so I think a couple I'm aware of, you've got Mongo, you've got
Yeah.
Snowflake, previously gone through that kind of licensing per seat. They've scaled the business that way. They've got the data to back it up, that they know their products are super sticky and they're well embedded within that enterprise. And to rip and replace is a big job. To then convert to a consumption model when you can see the consumption and it's going to pay dividends is probably gives you a lot more foresight on whether your MRR is actually ARR and whether that model is more effective. But to do it at this early when you've got a product that, as we talked before, people are struggling to adopt. There's a lot of evangelization that needs to be to happen. Going straight in with that consumption model and then building forecasts off the back of a product that's not sticky and they don't even know if it's really working is very short-sighted, and also probably baiting investors into a false sense of security. So what have you seen work then, in terms of how to adapt that kind of model from pure consumption, where all of a sudden your MRR can just fall off a cliff and your CFO sat scratching their head thinking, how are we going to hit our growth numbers, to actually taking the product and structuring a business model that is a lot more, gives you a lot more predictability and foresight of where you're going from a growth perspective, and ties customers in a little bit longer, I suppose.
Yeah, 100%. So there's a couple of things that you've got to get right. And I see this very early on. So first of all, it's about hiring a product manager. So too many of these Gen AI guys are very strong founders, very good knowledgeable experts, and then an R&D team that's built a fantastic, or research, which is research to me, and having spoke to quite a lot, I mean, I would say probably tens, if not 100 plus researchers in my time. They are extremely intelligent individuals who are very good at coding or mathematics and solutions and algorithms, right? But what they're not doing is building a
Scientists.
product. They're scientists, exactly. And so a lot of these guys, especially the early ones, but even some of them now that are coming out, are very, very focused on building the most perfect research model, the most perfect a solution, but not necessarily the most perfect product. And I think that's one that, to get it right, and I had there were some really great product managers at Stability and a couple of others in different fields from in. The big piece is, what does my customer actually want? What are the things that, going back to pain, right? It's all these things that, again, that just transfer from SaaS and previous. What am I solving? And if that problem is big enough and they're willing to pay, they will wait for you to finish building that product. But if you go in too early with too much hype, and this is what I'm saying, like, downcrease the hype. Don't say I can replace all my team with bots, right? Because that's not true today. And then I think that's the first one around product. The second one is
just jump in.
yeah,
So what I say from they basically they get into they can get to an MVP from a model perspective, but they're then trying to create this perfect product, but they're not getting to an MVP from an actual product perspective of what customers want. So it's like they're so focused on getting the perfect model, but that's great, but that's not the actual product that people need.
Yes, exactly. And you see that even with things like, I mean, you might have heard of DeepSeek, but everyone thinks about the blue whale. And we spent a long time, I was talking to a lot of different peers with the whole thing around DeepSeek, and every investor was thinking, oh my God, what do we do here? But the ultimate challenge to that as well is the open source market. And I think that's really important to understand as well. If you are building a product today, you don't need to build that on top of an API from OpenAI. I mean, you can do, don't get me wrong, because that's a really, really strong model. But you can also build it with open source, so models that are publicly available on the internet with their weights. So they basically, it's all the code that you need. And then you can put that into your own stack on any compute, any inference, and build your own solution, but with, effectively with your own IP or your own data built into that is a very different structure. And again, in more productized. So I think that's one piece. The other section to kind of touch on that is having the awareness and the knowledge of what your customer really wants. And again, this is why, both with Scale Gen.AI but with other stuff that I'm working on with different industries, is bringing those people much earlier in the conversation. Don't build a product in a silo that your investors might tell you, this is really cool, you've done a TAM, you really understand how big your market is. And then when you go to the enterprise, or you go to that partner and say, this is what we've built, they go, but I've already got that, or there's 20 versions of what you've already got. And you've basically spent all of your ideation phase building something that isn't quite ready for what your customers need, and hence that's why, like I said, I'm seeing so many POCs and opportunities, but not a lot of closed revenue.
Yeah, and I suppose when you're building a model and you're not building a product, I suppose it makes it really hard to then actually understand who your ideal customer profile is and where to target and where to focus. How have you advised companies that you've worked with in terms of that? Because that's like fundamental to getting your go-to-market right, is knowing who your customers are and who who has the pain that you can solve. Yeah, what have you advised in that regard?
Yeah, so it's a really good one. So I think when you look at ICP, there's obviously a bunch of metrics that you can use or frameworks to get to that point. And again, a lot of these incubators, you mentioned YC and some of these others, have ways for you to solve that. So they've got a pretty good idea of where they think they're going to go. The big challenge comes though, is the maturity model isn't overlaid on the top of that. So again, going back to like the call centers, for example, and voice AI agents, of course, there's a CIO in that call center, system or a BPO that's ready to replace the entire 15,000 person, call center team. But the actual company itself isn't in that early adopter phase, right? And I
Yeah,
think the big part of that, when you look at your ICP, is how innovative is that industry? So another one where they're extremely innovative is media. So media is always pushing the
yeah,
boundary, like ad tech as well. These kind of industries are pushing the boundaries all the time to get every single dollar, every single click, every single user view embedded so that they can generate more revenue versus going into an industrialized sector and saying I've got a Gen.AI product that's going to replace all of your unionized workers. So there's a real awareness and need to understand how to do it. I think the other part is your ICP in Gen.AI tends to now need to be vertically based rather than horizontal. You can still sell a GTM AI, SDR product, but there's a lot of them out there. And unless you can differentiate yourself, you just become one of 50 and then potentially one of 100 and one of 150 because there's more and more Gen AI startups coming. I'm seeing usually about at least 5 a day. I don't have the stats in front of me now, but it was something like 100 new startups are being ideated every week with Gen AI. So you also need to think about that in terms of lots of other people are going to come up with your idea. So verticalizing it is really important. And I think that's the bit where when we talk about pivot, it might not necessarily be pivoting to a completely new market. It might be just embedding yourself more. If you're in a space that's dealing with, transportation, for example, it might be picking a specific sector of transportation to verticalize. And then again, it goes back to that kind of rule with VCs as well, solving a really specific problem, or solving a really
yeah,
specific user case, not I've got a product that's going to replace all of your people, because that's the pitch that's
yeah.
just not. It might be great now where the hype's there, but when the dust settles, that's not what's going to be giving you, your revenue and that growth that you all want.
Yeah. No, that it applies to so many different industries. It's not just Gen AI. It's the same in SaaS. It's the same in recruitment. It's like that inch wide, mile deep focus. Find out what you're really good at. Find that kind of pain that you can solve better than anyone else. Get customers to absolutely love and rave about your product, and you're gonna, you'll be successful. I wanted to just we talked before about that kind of the commercial aspect and around like consumption and getting people tied into kind of contracts. Like, what challenges have you seen in terms of like the actual pricing? And this is the same across all different types of technology products. Do you price based on a margin? Do you price based on the value it drives? Like, how are you figuring it out? How are you seeing that within your customers? And like, what's working?
Yeah, so I think when they're in the ideation to pre-seed and seed, I mean, again, this is depends on what size of business and what they're trying to solve. But effectively,
Yeah,
it's about experimenting. There's a hell of a lot of experimenting, and I really encourage people not to overly focus at that point, unless they've got a rocket that they can really exploit. And in which case, focus on that channel and almost obsess about it. But is exploit, really understanding is a consumption model what my users, not just my users, but also the budget approvers of my users need in order to grow what they're going to do or to replace what they currently have. So again, I've seen it
yeah,
where we've had credits or tokens as an output, and then we've had to adapt that so that people and effectively larger companies and users can buy packages or bulk purchases of credits or tokens. And the reason is not because the user's like, that's all I've ever wanted. It's because the CFO says, I'm not paying for daily active dollar rates for every single usage you're making in that product. I need to see my cash
mm,
flow. I need to understand how much you're spending on that generative AI tool. And so that's why they come back to the table and say, we need a package, right? And again, it almost becomes back to like almost an ARR type approach where they're buying credits up front. But again, usually that's monthly or weekly, or it can be, bulk purchase. The other part of that is, I think, I mean, predicting now we're in 2025, but I think by 2030, everyone will have got they'll have got rid of annualized contracts and SaaS, and it'll all be, it was the old way of doing things. And suddenly people will wake up and go, oh my God, we need to do annualized contracts. And this whole new thing, ARR, is going to be a cool growth point, because so much of what we're building and investing in is based on ARR, right? It's based on those multipliers you get from 12-month contracts and churn rates based on month 13 as opposed to, day 2, and those kind of hyper-focused areas of metrics. And I think that's the other bit that's going to be super interesting as this evolves is, we've both been in that SaaS world. SaaS itself is not a bad model in terms of, you've got a 12-month. I mean, for me, I had contracts that were 5 years. So my TCVs were off the scale, And so that model, that revenue was so much more valuable to the VC later in the game. So like Series B, C, D and beyond. And I think that's the other bit. So yes, at pre-seed, seed and A, you need to show that, and you're going to have these great growth curves. But once that the challenge then becomes like, okay, how do I package this in a way that gives me more revenue, right? That I can actually count on in terms of growth, or how do I stop eroding my margins, which is a huge problem in Gen.AI, and I'm going to come on back to that in a second. But that's the bit that they're going to have to reinvent, and we're working on that right now with a couple of customers around how to convert that usage into more of a packaged model, so that it can give them also their way to scale beyond Series A. Because it worked in seed, but it doesn't work when you reach that next velocity piece. Coming back to margin, the other massive point that people forget is all of these generative AI companies, unless they're using somebody else's API, like an OpenAI or someone else, they have to pay for compute, or what's known as inference, right? And that is so much more expensive in Gen AI today than it was. So I don't have the numbers here, but someone was describing to me the cost of a Google search click versus a search in OpenAI, right? And the numbers are astronomically different in terms of margin. Because the cost of the compute to provide that same answer is so much more expensive, and it's the same across the board. So all these Gen AI companies have a fixed cost of compute that is sat there, and sometimes that can be 30 or even 40% of the margin at early days of that product that they're providing. And obviously, the more that comes down, the better. But likewise, that's never going to go away, because you're building on top of that model, which is running in the background on all that compute. And that's, as I said, that's the big margins and stuff to tackle.
That's why companies like NVIDIA, they're absolutely flying.
Yes, exactly. That's where the money's going. And also, if you're a VC, you need to be bloody careful not to invest in infra. So the other part that I've seen is VCs, because they've got so much FOMO, they've been throwing so much cash at these guys, and they've ended up basically investing in a data center, because they've by accident been buying chips, buying compute. And that's the other problem here, right? It's like, be careful what you're investing in.
Yeah. So I'm conscious of time. Dave, one of the things I wanted to sort of finalize is like where you see the market going. So there's the space is already like crowded. There's a lot of noise, but there are these sort of key players that are sort of renowned within the space. Where do you think it's going to go? Do you think this is going to end up being a series of big acquisitions over the next few years, and someone's going to swallow up the market, and there's going to be a couple of key players, or do you think the market itself, that there is space for such a high volume of, I suppose, niche players?
Yeah, so I think you're definitely going to see a hell of a lot of consolidation, and also a lot of failures. So I think you're going to see, if you look at the data of SaaS, and I don't remember the absolute numbers here, but less than 10% of companies make it to Series A. It's a very low number. It might even be 1%. But my point being is, you're going to see that in generative AI even more, because there's been even more companies created that then end up basically crashing and burning. But I likewise also see these huge areas where I think SaaS kind of failed, which is to really solve very, very specific approaches, also in vertical SaaS, by the way, so actually like right down in the deep belly of different verticals, in medical, etc., where I think there's a revenue stream for when I say a startup, I'm not talking about, a one-person startup with $1 million. I'm talking about a small team, but with 20 million or 30 million ARR or even more. And that is, I think, the bit that we didn't have in SaaS, because in SaaS you were basically encouraged. I mean, you needed, but you were encouraged to have a really big team. I remember talking about, I've got 450 employees where I was growing, and everything was all about how many employees I've got, and that number was an attribute. But I think what you're going to see is a lot of smaller teams using agentic AI underneath. Also, that's what we're doing in GTM. And that will also therefore mean that you've kind of got a couple of winners at the top, not much in the middle, and then a huge underneath, but they're much more verticalized than in the SaaS world. Yeah. And that's definitely a prediction, I think, that, for me is going to start happening over the next two years.
Well, listen, Dave, I feel like we could sit here and talk about this all day, and I'm by no means an expert in AI, but I really appreciate you giving the time to join us today and to share your experience. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And obviously anyone listening, whether you're a founder or you're a sales leader or an investor and you want advice on anything to do within Gen.AI, whether that's the commercial viability of the business, how to structure it, hiring salespeople, whatever that may be. I know from working with Dave over the years, he's got a lot of experience to share. So I really do appreciate your time, Dave. And have a safe trip home.
Yeah, thanks, Adam, mate. Really appreciate being on the podcast as well. And it's nice to talk about a lot of these things. I think, again, cutting through the hype is super important at this stage. What is real and what isn't. And yeah, I'm definitely all for talking about what's real.
Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Don't forget to subscribe. And if you want more information about the podcast, head over to our website, Scale with Strive.